Let me tell you about the winter that Sandy Delgado declared war on a bag of rock salt and somehow lost. I know how that sounds, I know. But stick with me here because this story gets wild in a way that only an HOA can make something wild, which is to say it gets petty and stupid and infuriating all at the same time, and then it gets absolutely, gloriously satisfying at the end. That's the part you want to stay for. My name is Paul Sanders. I've lived in the Pinecrest Commons neighborhood for going on 7 years now. It's a nice enough neighborhood, I'll say that. Good houses, decent yards, neighbors who mostly wave at each other and mind their own business. We've got a homeowners association because apparently that's just a thing that happens to you when you buy a house in a planned development, like a dental appointment or property taxes. You don't want it, you don't love it, but you figure you can live with it as long as nobody gets too crazy about it. Then Sandy Delgado got elected to the board. Actually, elected is a generous word. What happened was that 2 of the 3 board members moved out of the neighborhood within the same year, which left only one guy named Roger Fitch holding the whole operation together. Roger was a retired electrician who basically treated the HOA like a mild inconvenience he had to manage every few months. He put notices in the newsletter, he organized the summer cookout, and he never once made anyone feel bad about the color of their mailbox post. Roger was fine. Roger was perfectly fine. But Roger couldn't do everything alone, and when he put out a call for volunteers to fill the 2 empty board seats, exactly 2 people responded. One of them was my neighbor Dave Kowalski, who genuinely wanted to help and thought he could keep things sane. The other was Sandy Delgado. Sandy had moved into Pinecrest Commons about 3 years prior. She was maybe 50, 55, the kind of woman who had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Her house was always immaculate, her lawn always perfectly edged, her holiday decorations always deployed with military precision and taken down exactly on schedule. She kept a notebook, actual physical notebook, spiral-bound, that she carried around the neighborhood on her evening walks. People had seen her writing in it while looking at their houses. Nobody knew what she was writing down, but nobody felt great about it either. The moment Sandy got that board seat, things started to change. Roger tried his best to keep her in check, but she had energy he didn't, and she had a real talent for finding rules in the HOA documents that nobody had ever paid attention to, or in some cases rules that weren't quite there, but could be interpreted as being there if you squinted and tilted your head and ignored the actual plain language of the text. Dave Kowalski, my direct next-door neighbor, was the one who first told me things were going sideways. Dave is a good guy. Late 40s, works in it, has a wife named Carol and 2 teenage kids who are actually pretty respectful and don't blast music at midnight or anything. Dave was on the board, he knew what was happening from the inside, and he started warning me in October that Sandy was gearing up for something. She's been talking about enforcement, Dave said one afternoon when we were both raking leaves at the same time. Like, real enforcement. Fines, formal notices, the whole thing. I said that sounded annoying but probably manageable. Dave gave me a look that said he wasn't so sure. He was right not to be sure. Because December came, and with it came the worst early winter that our part of the state had seen in about a decade. I'm talking serious, old-fashioned winter. The kind where the meteorologists start sounding actually nervous on television. The first big snowfall hit us on December 9th, which was a Saturday, and it dropped 14 inches overnight. Just absolutely buried everything. My driveway, the street, the sidewalks, the mailboxes, all of it under this thick, heavy, wet snow that my back was already dreading before I even put my boots on. I got up early that morning, brewed the biggest mug of coffee I could manage, and stood at my front window just looking at it. It was actually beautiful for about 30 seconds, the way fresh snow always is before you remember you have to do something about it. The whole neighborhood was white and quiet and still. The streetlights were still on because it wasn't quite fully light yet, and everything had this blue-gray glow to it. Then I heard the scrape of a shovel from next door and I knew Dave was already at it. I got dressed and headed out myself. It was cold, really cold, the kind of cold that grabs you right in the lungs when you first step out. I'd say it was maybe 12 degrees, and the wind was adding a few more degrees of misery on top of that. I started on my driveway, which was going to take me a good hour given the volume of snow. Dave and I worked in parallel for a while, both of us too cold to do more than nod at each other and grunt occasionally. About halfway through my driveway, I noticed Dave doing something I hadn't thought of yet. He'd finished shoveling the sidewalk in front of his house, and he was now going back over it with a bag of rock salt, just spreading it in steady handfuls, creating a nice even layer that would keep ice from forming once the temperature dropped further after the sun went down. It was exactly the right thing to do. Standard winter maintenance. Every sensible homeowner in a cold climate does it. I made a mental note to grab my own salt out of the garage when I was done with the driveway. We both went inside eventually, warmed up, went about our Saturdays. The snow was beautiful. Life went on. The notice appeared in Dave's mailbox on Monday morning. He texted me a photo of it before I'd even had my second cup of coffee, and I had to read it twice to understand what I was looking at. It was an official-looking letter on HOA letterhead, signed by Sandy Delgado in her capacity as Compliance and Enforcement Coordinator, which was a title I was pretty sure she'd given herself because I'd never seen it on any HOA document before. The letter informed David Kowalski of 14 Pinecrest Drive that he had been observed on the morning of December 9th, distributing chemical agents on the public sidewalk in front of his property, in violation of HOA Community Standards Article 7, Section 3, Subsection B, which the letter summarized as prohibiting homeowners from applying unauthorized substances to shared community spaces without prior board approval. I read it again, and a third time. Dave was calling me before I finished the third read. "You saw it," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm looking at it right now," I said. "She cited Article 7, Section 3. Yeah. You want to know what Article 7, Section 3 actually says? Please. It says homeowners may not apply pesticides, herbicides, or commercial fertilizers to common area green spaces without written approval from the board." I sat with that for a second. That's about fertilizer on grass. On grass, in common areas, not sidewalks, not in winter, not rock salt, fertilizer on grass. Sandy sent you a formal compliance notice because you salted the sidewalk in front of your own house. She did. In December. In December, Paul. 12 degrees, 14 inches of snow. I'm trying to keep the sidewalk from turning into a hockey rink so nobody breaks an ankle walking past my house, and I get a formal compliance notice. I told him to send me the full HOA documents, the actual CC and RS and the bylaws, the whole package. He sent them over within 10 minutes. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down to read them, which I had never done in 7 years of living in Pinecrest Commons because I had previously assumed I would never need to. I read the whole thing, all 42 pages. Article 7, Section 3 was exactly what Dave said it was. Fertilizer, grass, common areas. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing in those documents, said a single word about rock salt, ice melt, sidewalk treatment, or anything remotely related to winter ice management on the paved surfaces in front of individual homes. The sidewalk in front of Dave's house wasn't even a common area in the technical sense used by the documents. The CC and RS were very specific about what counted as common areas, and individual sidewalk frontages were not on that list. Not only was Sandy's interpretation of the rule wrong, it was spectacularly wrong. She hadn't bent a rule. She hadn't found a loophole. She had just invented a violation out of nothing and slapped a formal notice on it. But here's the thing about HOA notices, and this is something I learned that day that I wish I'd known sooner. Even a baseless notice carries a deadline and a threat. Dave's notice gave him 14 days to respond or he'd face a $50 fine, and if the behavior continued after that, fines would double for each subsequent occurrence. So while Sandy was completely in the wrong, doing nothing was still going to cost Dave money. I drove over to his house that afternoon. We sat at his kitchen table with the HOA documents spread out between us like a battle map, which I suppose is exactly what they were at that point. Dave's wife Carol brought us both hot chocolate, which was genuinely the right call for the mood we were in. "I'm thinking I just write back and cite the actual rule," Dave said. "Tell her she's looking at the wrong section." "That's what she wants," I said. "You respond on her terms, you're acknowledging her authority to issue the notice in the first place. You're playing defense." Dave thought about that. "So what do you suggest?" "I've been thinking about this since that morning." "You're on the board, Dave." "Yeah." "So call a board meeting. You have the right to call one. Request a full review of the compliance notice. Put it on record that the notice was issued without legal basis. Make Roger and Sandy both show up and defend it in front of the community if they want." Dave liked this. You could see it in his face, the way someone looks when they realize they have more options than they thought. "Can I do that?" I showed him page 14 of the bylaws. Any board member could request an emergency session with 48 hours notice to all board members and public notice to residents. The meeting had to be held within 7 days of the request. Dave sent the formal request that evening. Sandy's response came the next morning, which was impressive speed for someone who claimed to be enforcing community standards rather than waging a personal campaign. She sent an email to both Dave and Roger stating that the compliance notice was not a matter requiring board review, as it had been issued pursuant to the existing enforcement procedures already authorized by the board. She also CC'd 3 other neighbors who were, as far as I could tell, people she'd been cultivating as allies over the past year or so. Roger, to his credit, replied to everyone and said he thought a board meeting was reasonable and they should schedule one. That was the moment Sandy realized she didn't quite have the control she thought she had. The meeting was set for the following Thursday evening at the community room in the neighborhood's small clubhouse. It was the kind of space with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting and a whiteboard that always smelled faintly of old markers. Not exactly a courtroom, but it would do. In the days leading up to it, I did 2 things that turned out to be very important. The first thing was that I talked to people, not in a gossip way, not in a let me tell you about Sandy way, just honestly. I knocked on doors and had real conversations. I mentioned what had happened with Dave, and I asked whether other neighbors had received any notices or had any issues with the HOA lately. What I found out surprised me a little, though maybe it shouldn't have. Sandy had been busy. In the 2 months since she'd taken her board seat, she had sent formal notices to 7 different households in Pinecrest Commons. The issues ranged from genuinely head-scratching to outright baffling. One couple had gotten a notice about the angle of their fence post, which Sandy claimed exceeded the allowable deviation from vertical under a provision that, when I looked it up, turned out to apply only to perimeter walls, not decorative fencing. Another household had been cited for having a propane grill stored on their side porch, which Sandy claimed violated the no commercial equipment rule, a rule that was very clearly about commercial service vehicles and heavy machinery, not backyard grills. A third neighbor, an older woman named Margaret who lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, had gotten a letter saying her holiday wreath was too large and exceeded the maximum allowable door decoration size under a guideline that, as far as anyone could find, did not exist anywhere in the actual HOA documents. Every single one of these notices had come with a fine deadline. Every single one was based on a misreading, a misapplication, or in some cases a flat-out fabrication of the rules, and every single one had been signed by Sandy Delgado in her self-assigned role as compliance and enforcement coordinator. I started a spreadsheet. Date of notice, household, stated violation, actual rule text, assessment of whether the notice had any legal basis. It took me a couple of evenings, but I had it done by the time Thursday came around. The second thing I did was stop by Margaret's house. Margaret Chen had lived at the corner of Pinecrest Drive and Maple Branch Lane since before any of the rest of us had moved in. She was 71 years old, sharp as a tack, and had worked as a paralegal for 30 years before retiring. She'd gotten Sandy's wreath notice and hadn't done anything with it yet because, she told me, she'd been waiting to see what happened with Dave's situation before deciding how to respond. When I showed her my spreadsheet, she got very quiet for a moment in a way that wasn't uncertainty. It was the quiet of someone calibrating. "The wreath rule doesn't exist," she said, tapping the relevant line in my spreadsheet. "No," I said. "I went through every version of the HOA documents going back to the founding. There's no decoration size guideline anywhere." So she made it up. "Looks that way," Margaret nodded slowly. Then she said, "Pull up the state nonprofit corporation code for me on your phone." I did. She read for a few minutes, her reading glasses down on her nose, perfectly at ease. "Here," she said. "Section 44, subsection 7. An officer of a nonprofit homeowners association who issues false or fraudulent compliance notices or fines for the purpose of extracting financial penalties from members may be held personally liable for the amounts extracted, plus damages, and may be subject to removal from office." "She's been extracting fines," I said. "She has been attempting to. The question is whether anyone's actually paid." I went back to my neighbors. Two of them had paid. The fence-post couple had paid $50 because they didn't know they could contest it. Margaret had not paid because, as she'd said, she was waiting. The grill couple had not paid because they just assumed it would go away. Everyone else was still within the notice window. The fence-post couple had paid Sandy Delgado $50 based on a notice that had no legal foundation, that cited a rule that didn't apply to their situation, for a violation that, as far as anyone could tell, didn't exist. That changed things considerably. Thursday came with another snowstorm, because apparently the sky hadn't gotten the memo that we had enough going on already. It was a lighter one this time, maybe 4 inches overnight and into the morning, but it was the kind of wet, heavy snow that freezes fast and turns into serious black ice by evening. By the time people started making their way to the community meeting at 7 o'clock, Pinecrest Drive was essentially one long skating rink despite the road crew having been through earlier in the day. I watched from my front porch as people picked their way carefully down the sidewalk. Dave was out with his rock salt again, spreading it on the sidewalk in front of his house, and then, because Dave is actually a decent human being, spreading it in both directions for a good 20 feet past his property line so his neighbors on either side would have safe footing too. I watched this with a particular kind of satisfaction that I can't entirely explain, except to say that sometimes the small acts of defiance are the ones that matter most. About 40 people showed up for the meeting, which was more than double what these things usually drew. The community room was packed. People were standing along the walls. Half the neighborhood had apparently been wanting an excuse to show up, and word had gotten around that something interesting was going to happen. Roger opened the meeting in his usual style, which was calm and slightly tired. Sandy sat at the board table with her notebook open in front of her and her pen ready, and she had the look of someone who was fully confident that the room was going to go the way she expected. She had not done sufficient research about the room. Dave stood up first and laid out the situation with the rock salt notice. He was clear and factual and didn't editorialize much. He cited Article 7, Section 3, and what it actually said, compared to what Sandy's notice claimed it said. He was polite about it, but he was precise, and precision was exactly the right weapon for this situation. Sandy began to speak almost before Dave sat down. She said that the intent of the rule was clear, that the board had discretion in interpreting rules to serve the community's interests, that chemical applications to paved surfaces could damage the concrete and create environmental runoff issues, and that she had a responsibility to enforce community standards comprehensively. Concrete damage and environmental concerns are your basis, Margaret said from the third row. Her voice was mild and pleasant in the way that experienced legal professionals can be mild and pleasant when they're actually being extremely direct. Sandy turned to look at her. That's correct, Margaret. We have a duty to protect community assets. The sidewalk in front of Dave's house is not a community asset under Article 1, Section 2 of our CC and RS, Margaret said. The paved sidewalk frontage within 10 feet of any dwelling is the maintenance responsibility of that property's owner, which also means it's under that owner's management discretion for practical purposes. The only authority the HOA has over individual property maintenance is in areas explicitly enumerated in Article 3. Rock salt application to private sidewalk frontage is not among the enumerated authorities. Sandy blinked, just for a second, but it was noticeable. The board has broad interpretive discretion under the governing documents, Sandy said. It does, Margaret agreed, within the bounds established by state law governing nonprofit HOAs. Specifically, the board cannot issue compliance notices or levy fines for matters not explicitly covered by the governing documents. That's not my interpretation, it's statute. She had printed the relevant code section. She held it up. It was 3 pages, highlighted in yellow. I could feel the mood in the room shift. Not dramatically, not like a movie moment where everyone gasps. Just a subtle tightening, people sitting forward a little, people looking at each other with raised eyebrows. I stood up then because that was our agreed sequence. I introduced myself, which was unnecessary since everyone knew me, but it helped establish the formal tone of what I was about to say. Then I presented the spreadsheet. I had printed copies for everyone in the room because I'd stayed up until midnight running them off at my home printer, and I walked up and down the rows handing them out while Dave put the digital version up on the community room's wall-mounted TV using his laptop. I walked through it methodically. Each notice, each cited rule, each actual rule text, each gap between them. I was calm about it. I didn't call Sandy names or accuse her of anything outright. I just presented the information and let it speak for itself. The room was very quiet by the time I sat down. Roger looked at the spreadsheet for a long moment. He was a retired electrician with no particular agenda, and he was reading the information in front of him the way a person reads something that makes them feel genuinely uncomfortable. Not defensive, just troubled. "Sandy," he said quietly, "did you draft these notices yourself without bringing them to me first?" A pause. "I'm the compliance and enforcement coordinator. I have the authority to issue notices under the enforcement framework." "There isn't an enforcement framework," Roger said. "We don't have a dedicated enforcement committee. That was something discussed at the August meeting but never formally adopted. I don't know what compliance and enforcement coordinator means because we never voted on that title or that role." This was new information for most of the room, and you could feel it land. Sandy's jaw tightened slightly. The role was understood to be part of my board responsibilities. "By whom?" Roger asked. No answer. One of the neighbors I'd spoken to, a man named Garrett who'd gotten the grill notice, raised his hand. "I want to be clear about something. I got a notice saying my propane grill violated the commercial equipment rule. I looked that rule up. It's about commercial service vehicles. My grill has nothing to do with that rule. Am I correct that this notice had no actual basis?" "The spirit of the rule," Sandy began. "I'm asking about the rule, not its spirit," Garrett said. Another neighbor raised her hand. And then another. Each one had a story, and each story came from the spreadsheet I'd handed them, which gave them the specific language and the specific gap. What had been a collection of isolated frustrations became a pattern in real time, in front of the whole community, and there was no way to unsee it once it was laid out that clearly. Sandy tried several things over the next 20 minutes. She tried the enforcement discretion argument, which Margaret continued to dismantle with specific statutory citations. She tried the community standards matter argument, which was hard to maintain when the standards she'd been invoking didn't exist in the documents. She tried something close to an emotional appeal about property values and neighborhood quality, which might have worked in a different room, but didn't work in this one, because people were holding a spreadsheet that directly contradicted her. At one point she said, loudly enough to be heard clearly, that people who didn't want to maintain community standards could leave the community. That probably wasn't her best moment. Roger rubbed his forehead. Sandy, I need to ask you directly. The fence post notice, Mr. and Mrs. Alderman paid a $50 fine on that. Was that fine deposited into the HOA account? Silence. Sandy. The HOA account, yes, of course. Roger pulled out his phone and looked at something for a moment. I had a feeling he'd been going through the HOA bank account on his phone while the meeting was going on, which suggested that Roger, for all his apparent laid-back energy, was not actually asleep at the wheel. I'm looking at the account activity for the past 2 months, Roger said. I see the alderman's payment. I want to verify the HOA received it correctly. Was it deposited via check or electronic transfer? Check, Sandy said. The deposit on that date shows $50 in, which is consistent. Okay, he kept reading his phone. His face was doing something I couldn't quite interpret. I'm going to need to review the full account history with the bank. There are some line items here I don't recognize. This produced a new quality of silence in the room. What kind of line items? Margaret asked. Payments out, Roger said carefully. To vendors I don't recognize, for services I wasn't aware of. I'm not going to speculate about what they are until I've had a chance to look into it properly, but I want it on record that this question exists. I glanced at Dave. Dave looked back at me. We were both thinking the same thing, which was that we had come here expecting a fight about rock salt and had apparently stumbled into something considerably larger. The meeting adjourned without any formal resolution because Roger wanted time to review the finances before making any board decisions. He asked everyone to hold their notices in abeyance while the review happened. Sandy objected to this on procedural grounds, but was outvoted 2-1 by Roger and Dave. People filed out into the cold night, most of them stopping to talk in small clusters in the parking lot, despite the temperature being somewhere around 10 degrees. There was that specific kind of energy that happens when a community discovers it's been dealing with the same problem in isolation and suddenly realizes it's not alone. Dave salted the parking lot entrance on his way out, which I thought was a nice touch. The next few days moved fast. Roger went through the HOA financial records carefully, and he called me on Friday afternoon, which told me he was treating this as more than a routine review. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course. I'm finding payments from the HOA account to something called PCS Management Services, $2,200 over the past 4 months. Do you know what that is? I did not know what that was. Me neither, Roger said. I've been the primary signatory on this account for 8 years. I never authorized these payments. The other signatory is a board member. There are 2 board members besides me. Dave tells me he never authorized them either. That left 1 person. I think I need to call someone, Roger said. I think you probably do, I said. To his credit, Roger called the bank first to confirm the transactions, then called a lawyer he knew from his electrician days who handled small business and nonprofit disputes, then called the police. Not in a dramatic way, just methodically and in the right order. That was Roger's thing, doing things in the right order. It turned out to be exactly the right quality for the situation. PCS Management Services, the investigation would eventually reveal, was a company registered to Sandy Delgado's nephew. The payments had been characterized in the HOA records as payments for snow removal services and general property management, neither of which had actually been provided to the community. The HOA had never contracted with PCS Management Services in any board vote or any meeting. The payments had been authorized using Sandy's signatory authority as a board member, which was valid for operational expenses, but not for unapproved contracts. This was, in fairly plain terms, fraud. Two uniformed officers showed up at Sandy Delgado's house on a Tuesday morning in December, with snow still on the ground from the latest round and icicles hanging from every gutter on the block. I didn't watch it happen because I'm not that kind of person, but I heard about it from 3 separate neighbors within an hour, so I didn't need to watch it. The whole neighborhood knew by lunchtime. Sandy was not arrested on the spot because these things take time and process. But she was brought in for questioning, and her nephew was contacted as well, and the bank account was frozen pending investigation. She resigned from the HOA board that afternoon, through a terse email to Roger that offered no explanation and no apology. Roger called an emergency meeting for the following Saturday to update the community. In the meantime, life in Pinecrest Commons went on being wintry and cold. Another snowfall hit on Thursday, nothing major, maybe 3 inches, but temperatures stayed low so it packed hard. I spent Friday morning shoveling my driveway, and then, because I had the energy and the salt and frankly the mood for it, I went and knocked on Margaret's door and asked if she wanted me to do her front walk too. She accepted and then came out with her own shovel and helped, which was not what I'd expected but probably should have been. We worked next to each other in the cold, breath fogging, the snow squeaking under our boots the way it does when it's really frozen, and I thought about how the whole thing had started with Dave spreading rock salt on his sidewalk and Sandy deciding that was somehow a problem that needed solving. Do you think she actually believed the rules said what she claimed they said? I asked Margaret. Margaret thought about it. I think she knew they didn't, she said. A person who genuinely believed the rules supported her would have been less defensive when asked to show her work. Her reaction to having the actual rule language presented was to pivot to spirit and discretion. That's not someone who made an honest mistake. That's someone who knows the specific argument isn't there. And the money thing. That was always the goal, Margaret said. The notices were tools. Generate enough fear of fines and enough deference to her authority, and you can keep people from looking at the money. It made sense. The aggressive enforcement push, the invented violations, the intimidation by official letter, all of it was pressure designed to make residents afraid to push back. If nobody questions you, nobody looks at where the money's going. Sandy had miscalculated on Dave, probably because she hadn't expected him to fight rather than pay up, and hadn't anticipated that fighting would mean a public meeting, which meant the whole community looking at everything at once. The Saturday meeting was a different atmosphere from the Thursday one, still packed, but with a different energy. Less confrontational tension, more genuine community conversation. Roger walked everyone through what had been found in the finances, what had been reported to police, and what the HOA's attorney had advised in terms of next steps. He was matter-of-fact about it, not sensational, just honest. The total amount taken from the HOA account was $4,300 over the period that Sandy had been on the board. It wasn't a devastating sum in absolute terms, but it was money that belonged to everyone in the community, and it had been taken without authorization or transparency. Roger read out the steps they were taking. The bank had been cooperative. The HOA's attorney was pursuing civil recovery. The police investigation was ongoing. Sandy's board seat was formally vacated effective immediately. A community vote would be held in January to fill the open seats properly. Several people asked questions. Everything was answered directly. When the meeting ended, people didn't cluster in the parking lot this time. They talked to each other on the way home in smaller groups, walking together along the salted sidewalks through the cold night air. The fence-post couple, the Aldermans, got their $50 back within 2 weeks. The HOA's attorney sent a formal demand letter, and Sandy paid it promptly, which was probably the most sensible thing she did in the entire affair. Dave's rock salt notice was formally withdrawn and destroyed. Roger sent a written notice to the entire community confirming that the salt citation had been issued without authority. That rock salt and ice melt application to individual property frontages was not, and had never been subject to any HOA rule or approval process, and that residents should feel completely free to manage their sidewalks as they saw fit during winter weather conditions. Dave read this letter standing in his driveway, in the cold, next to his truck, and I watched him fold it up and tuck it into his coat pocket with the kind of satisfaction that comes from having been right and having made it count. "You know what the dumbest part of this whole thing is," he said to me. "What's that?" "I've been salting this sidewalk every winter for 4 years, never once had a problem. She watched me do it for 4 years and never said anything. But the moment she had a little bit of power, suddenly it was a crisis." That was exactly it, wasn't it? The salt had never been the problem. The salt was just what was closest when Sandy decided to start asserting herself, and then it became a convenient first target. If it hadn't been the salt, it would have been something else. The thing about a person who uses authority primarily to feel powerful is that they'll always find something to enforce, because enforcement is the point, not the rule. January came and the neighborhood held its board election with actually competitive candidates, meaning more than one person stepped up for each seat, which hadn't happened in years. Margaret Chen ran for one of the open seats and won easily. A younger guy named Marcus, who just moved in 2 years ago, ran for the other and won by a comfortable margin. Roger stayed on as the third member and finally had a board around him that he could actually work with. At the first full board meeting in January, which was open to the community, one of the first things they did was go through all the compliance notices Sandy had issued. Every single one was reviewed against the actual governing documents, and every one that lacked a genuine legal basis was formally rescinded, and a letter sent to the affected household confirming the rescission. It took 2 meetings and a lot of careful reading, but by the end of it, 7 households had received formal apologies and 2 had received refunds of fines paid. The community also voted to establish a formal process for issuing compliance notices, meaning no single board member could issue an enforcement notice unilaterally. Any notice required a majority board vote in a recorded session, with a written citation of the specific rule and the specific observed behavior, and the homeowner had 30 days to respond before any fine was assessed. It was simple, it was reasonable, and it was the kind of thing the HOA probably should have had in place from the beginning. Margaret pushed for one more change, which was a rule requiring that all HOA expenditures over $200 be approved by at least 2 board members and documented in board minutes. After what had happened with the mystery vendor payments, nobody objected. The police investigation moved forward into February. It was not a fast process, because financial crime investigations rarely are, but it moved. Sandy's nephew cooperated early and provided documentation of the arrangement, which accelerated things considerably. By early March, Sandy Delgado was formally charged with misappropriation of nonprofit funds and breach of fiduciary duty. Her attorney worked out a plea arrangement that included full restitution to the HOA, a 2-year suspended sentence, community service, and a permanent prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any nonprofit organization in the state. I found out about the plea through Roger, who called me as soon as he heard. "Full restitution," I said. "Every dollar," Roger confirmed. "And she can't serve on another HOA. Not anywhere in the state. It's part of the court order." I stood there in my kitchen for a moment, just processing that. There's a specific feeling that comes when something that should happen actually happens, when the system that's supposed to protect people actually does protect people, and it's different from what you expect. It's not triumphant exactly. It's quieter than that. It's more like the feeling of a tense muscle finally relaxing. "How's the account looking?" I asked. "Better than it has in months," Roger said. "We've got the restitution coming in, we've got our reserves intact, and we've got a budget for the spring projects that actually make sense." The spring projects, as it turned out, included repaving part of the community parking area, which had needed it for 2 years, and adding proper lighting to the walking path around the neighborhood pond, which people had been asking for even longer. Both of these things had been in the HOA's capital improvement plan for years and had kept getting pushed back because the money wasn't there. It turned out the money actually had been there. It just hadn't been going where it was supposed to go. Winter eased slowly, the way it does. The big snowfalls gave way to smaller ones, and then to the kind of cold rain that means spring is a few weeks away, and then to the tentative early warmth that makes you want to believe the worst is over. The sidewalks dried out and the ice retreated, and the salt Dave had spread over his front walk over the course of the winter gradually washed away with the melt and left clean, intact concrete behind. The concrete, I will note, showed absolutely zero damage from the rock salt, which should surprise nobody except perhaps Sandy Delgado, who had cited concrete damage as one of her justifications, and who had at no point, as far as anyone could determine, actually consulted any information about rock salt and concrete. Dave was still on the HOA board, and if anything, more engaged in it than before. He said once that going through all of this had made him realize how much the HOA actually mattered when it worked correctly. The services, the common maintenance, the standards that kept the neighborhood looking good, all of that was real and had value. It just had to be run honestly and transparently for it to be worth anything. Margaret said something similar at the spring community meeting, where she presented the HOA's first fully transparent annual financial report in what Roger estimated was at least 5 years. Every line item, every vendor, every approved expenditure, laid out clearly in a document that any homeowner could review. People actually read it, which felt like a small miracle. People asked questions about it, which felt like an even bigger one. Roger, standing at the front of the room with his wireless presentation clicker and his slightly tired eyes, looked more relaxed than I'd seen him look in months. He'd spent the better part of a year dealing with the fallout from someone else's bad behavior, and now he was standing in front of a community that was actually paying attention and actually engaged, and I think that meant something to him. The summer cookout was the best one the neighborhood had ever put on, or at least the most attended. Dave brought his grill, the one Sandy had tried to cite as commercial equipment, and it turned out he was an exceptional griller, which the community had been missing out on because of a completely fabricated rule. Margaret brought an enormous tray of dumplings that disappeared within about 15 minutes. I brought beer and set up lawn chairs and generally felt good about things. We were sitting around after the food was mostly gone, talking about nothing in particular, when someone brought up the salt incident. These things always come up eventually at neighborhood gatherings, because a story that absurd becomes part of the neighborhood's identity. You retell it, and it gets a little funnier each time, not because the underlying thing was funny, but because humor is how people process the retrospective absurdity of having been pushed around by a bag of rock salt. Someone did an impression of Sandy's voice saying chemical agents, which was probably not the most charitable thing but got a genuine laugh. Dave shook his head. All of this because I put salt on my sidewalk. Not all of this, I said. The salt was just where she decided to start. The rest was already there waiting to be found. You know what I think about sometimes, Dave said. I think about the person who might have slipped on that sidewalk if I hadn't salted it. An older person, walking past in the dark, freezing cold, icy concrete, and Sandy decided that was something that needed to be stopped. That landed quietly in the conversation and nobody argued with it, because it was exactly right. At the core of everything, under all the legal documents and the financial fraud and the board politics and the community meetings, there was this. A man put salt on his sidewalk so nobody would get hurt, and someone decided that was a problem. The fact that someone was now prohibited from ever running another HOA was, under the circumstances, exactly as it should be. I drove home from the cookout in the long summer evening light, windows down, thinking about the winter. How it had felt to stand in 12-degree cold with a mug of coffee, looking at the snow. How the first scrape of Dave's shovel had sounded through the frozen air. How the notice had appeared in his mailbox like some kind of insult to the season, this officious little document trying to make something simple into something complicated. There's a thing about winter that gets to the point of what community actually means. When it's that cold and there's that much snow, you cannot be entirely self-sufficient. You need the roads to be cleared. You need your neighbors to have shoveled their walks so you can get past without breaking something. You need someone to spread salt so the ice doesn't take out the elderly woman down the block. You need to be, in small but real ways, counted on by the people around you and to count on them in return. An HOA, when it works, is supposed to support that kind of community. Common spaces maintained, standards upheld, resources pooled for things that are better handled collectively. Not a tool for one person's ego or one person's financial benefit. Not a bureaucratic machine for manufacturing violations out of thin air. Not a mechanism for making people afraid to take care of their own property. Dave had spread salt on his sidewalk, because that's what you do for each other in winter. Sandy had tried to stop it because she'd confused having authority over the community with owning the community. The difference between those two things is the difference between a neighborhood and a fiefdom, and it turned out the neighborhood was not interested in being anyone's fiefdom. The HOA met its quarterly obligations that fall on time and under budget for the first time in the 3 years Roger had been keeping track. The reserves were healthy, the capital improvements were scheduled, and the board meetings, now properly noticed and properly minuted, ran about 45 minutes on average and ended with people feeling informed rather than antagonized. Margaret told me once that the best-run organizations are the ones where the people with authority feel most accountable to the people they serve, not least. She said it simply and matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, like it was obvious. And it was obvious. It's always obvious. The trick is building systems that make it difficult for someone to forget that obvious thing, and then enforcing those systems when someone tries. A few people in the neighborhood asked me, over the months that followed, whether I felt bad about how it had ended for Sandy, whether the legal consequences had been too much, whether we'd been too aggressive in pursuing it. I thought about those questions honestly, because they deserved honest consideration. What I kept coming back to was the aldermans. This couple who'd gotten a letter claiming their fence post was in violation of a rule that didn't apply to them, and who'd written a $50 check because they trusted that the HOA was operating in good faith and the notice was real. That trust had been exploited. The money was real. The anxiety of receiving a formal compliance notice and worrying about additional fines was real. And it had been manufactured deliberately by someone who knew the rule didn't actually support the fine. No, I didn't feel bad about the legal consequences. I felt like the legal consequences were proportionate and appropriate and arrived at through a fair process. That's the best any of us can ask for. By the following December, the 1-year anniversary of the whole thing, Pinecrest Commons was in genuinely good shape. The neighborhood looked better than it had in years, partly because the spring and fall common area maintenance had been properly funded and executed for the first time in a while. People were more engaged in the HOA process, more likely to show up to meetings, more likely to vote. Margaret had already identified 2 potential board candidates for the following year's election, people she'd been talking to and encouraging, which suggested she was thinking about succession and stability in a way that bode well. The second December snowfall came on a Saturday morning again, almost exactly a year after the one that had started all of this. I stood at my front window with my coffee, the same as I had the year before, looking at the quiet white street. Then I heard the scrape of a shovel from next door. I smiled, got dressed, went out to do my own driveway. Dave was already at his sidewalk by the time I was out there, working steadily in the cold. He had his shovel and his bucket of rock salt, same as always. Same practical winter maintenance routine that any sensible homeowner in a cold climate would carry out without a second thought. He looked over at me and grinned. "You think I'm going to get a notice?" he said. "I think you're going to get a neighborhood that doesn't slip on ice," I said. He laughed and threw another handful of salt onto the clean-shoveled concrete, and it scattered in a wide arc across the sidewalk and caught the low winter light and glittered for just a second before settling into its work, which was exactly what it was supposed to do.